most of you know John Hopkins. John lives 90 miles away, so we don't see as much of him as most of the STEAM team members, but his brother Mark is with us a little more often, and John lives in Columbia, Maryland, but the two Hopkins brothers have mastered the Stanleys in pretty good shape. They've been with us since the first year, 1997, and John has given this final lecture. This will be the second time, I think, isn't that right, John? He did it last year on pulling everything together that makes a Stanley click. So, John, if you don't know everyone here, I can connect you later if you'd like to speak to. And
now,
so
Bill, Bill had
much.
a couple of comments. And
Bill, go ahead.
Thanks, Tom. After John's lecture tonight, we have a sign-up sheet here for Stanley lessons, driving a Stanley. And if you want to come up and put your name down, we'd like you to sign up for 2 lessons. There's some on Saturdays, Thursday nights, there's one on a Tuesday night, and there's one on a Sunday. So you'll be able to look at the dates, and if you can't come up with an idea of when you want to do it tonight, I'll give you my telephone number and we can go over it over the phone or something like that. Okay? And depending upon how many people we get that want to drive the Stanley will depend upon how many we'll have in the car the day or the night that you'll drive it. It'd be nice if we could just have 2, but chances are we'll probably have 3 with an instructor. I've got 5 instructors. Tom is one of them, and 4 of the younger group of the STEAM team. So just remember that when John is done to try and sign up. Okay, thank you.
plus, we have a new members interest survey. And a few of these have names on them and some of them don't. So afterwards, if you haven't seen one of these, come up and try and grab it with your name on it. And or if you don't have one with a name, there are blank ones. Also, I think we're looking for some more help for Sunday from 1 to 4:30. And I know Richard is handling that. If anybody has interest, express it to me, I guess, or Tom, and we'll make sure Richard gets to know. Just so I get a feel, how many people are used to driving or have been around old cars? And I don't mean this new stuff in the 40s and 50s, but I mean, say 1920s and older.
Oh, old one, 30s. 30s, isn't it?
30s is, 20s is getting kind of new, but any pre-20 or pre-10? Okay. Does everybody have one of these?
No.
We're just going to kind of walk through a day of coming here and taking a car out. So we're going to go from kind of beginning to end. And then at the end, we'll get into a few miscellaneous things which I don't believe have been covered in previous courses. And I have some tools and other sort of things that we normally take with us that we can talk about, and I don't know if you've seen them or had any experience with them. We, of course, as a group, have had a number of events when we'll come here in the morning and fire up a whole bunch of cars at once. Now, when everybody kind of gets here, the determination will be made as to which car will be going out, and you know, that kind of works its way, or Tom will assign people cars or that sort of thing. Some people tend to get associated with certain cars, so when we have a mass outing, we'll just kind of migrate to those cars. The first thing you want to do when you get to your car is just start looking at some of the basic levels. Now, some of this has to do with whether you've taken the car out before or whether, say, it's been worked on the Thursday night before. I mean, if you come here Thursday night, you can do some of this stuff Thursday night before you go. Such things as checking the main fuel level and checking the pilot fuel level. Now, most of the trips we make here are pretty short, so main fuel is not such a big deal. But it is something that needs to be paid attention to, especially if we're going out for a long day. And when you're touring and that sort of thing, it really needs to be paid attention to. The kerosene tank is located right out here on the corner. And it works. It's the old style, where there's a tube, there's an overflow tube that has to be set to a given height. The original concept at the time is the overflow tube would have been, say, set at 5 gallons. And then the bowl at the top is pumped up to 5 gallons, and the overflow runs in the tube, and then exactly that 5 gallons would be put into the tank. So we use that to fill it up. Hexane is located in a 55-gallon drum that's up in front of the garage. Now there's inside the garage, there's a container that's used to put hexane into the cars, and you'll just have to kind of figure out which container that is, because there's a lot of them and it's not. So when you're adding pilot fuel, you want to make sure there's at least about 1.5 inches of airspace left at the top of the tank. Failure to follow this rule will result in frequent stops. I've been there and done that. Mostly because it was my brother who filled the pilot tank.
Sure.
Brother that mysteriously isn't here.
Yeah, I know, so you can get blamed for that one. Repressurize the pilot tank. Now, the cars have in various locations places where you repressurize the tank. And that you're just going to kind of have to learn for each car. Some of the older cars tends to be done at the pilot gauge on the dash. Some of the condensing cars, it's actually done under the front seat. The 740, for example, actually has an auxiliary air tank on it that you can use to recharge either the pilot or the main. And we'll get to the main in a minute. Once you get the pilot tank repressurized,
Excuse me, what do you recharge it with?
air.
You have a regular air compressor and a Schrader fitting, or?
Yes, they're Schrader fittings. Now, Tom has an air tank, a small 4 or 5 gallon air tank that floats around here that you can just grab and take to the car to refill it. And there's a big compressor in the shop that can refill that. There's also a small rechargeable air compressor that is around too that we normally take with us when we're out on the road. Sometimes we'll take the big air tank as well when we go out on the road. Now when you recharge initially the pilot tank, as you go through the firing up procedure, of course you'll use some fuel out of the pilot with the firing up valve, but also the fuel will absorb some of the air. So generally before you'll leave the property, you'll recharge it again. By that point, it's probably good for a good part of the day and it will not need to be recharged. The pressures on the pilot would tend to run from about 20 to the low 30s, depending on the car. And you'll learn to understand the car or just ask somebody that's used that car. Certain pilots burn hotter than others and they just tend to need different pressures. When you get here and look at the car, you want to make sure that the main fuel pressure is somewhere, say, in the neighborhood of 100 psi, which is what it should be sitting here in the museum. If it's real low, then that likely means there could be some problem, or there could be some leak, or there's something not right. Also, if it's real low, that definitely means you'll need to recharge the main fuel with air. And that's a little bit different that's a bit of a different procedure because the main fuel, of course, is at much higher pressure. So generally to recharge it with air, you'll want to let the fuel pressure get down to 80 or so and then recharge it up to 120. So quite often when you arrive here in the museum, the pressure may be too high to recharge it. So you'll have to wait till you get into the firing up procedure to recharge it, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we get. Tire pressure in the car should be about 50 to 55 psi for most of the cars that you'll be driving. Once you get here, you know, it's always a good idea to walk around and look at the cars. These cars are, for the most part, 80 to 90 years old and older, and they've been around a long time. So you want to look at the brake pads on the cars that have those exposed pads that you can see. Just kind of walk around it and check, and once in a while even just get under the car and look and see if anything that you think looks different or odd. You know, the occasional nuts can come loose. All sorts of things can happen. Not that they're frequent, but it's better to find out sitting here in the museum than it is down the road somewhere. The next thing is checking for the boiler water level. Normally when you come in here in the museum, the throttle will be advanced and the water bypasses will be open. Now normally when a car is put away, we'll kind of get into this to the end, when you put the car away, you lock the throttle and you close the water bypass valves. That will ensure that the boiler siphons and siphons the boiler full of water. Now typically the day after the cars have been driven, Tom will come in, and if he thinks that the boilers have siphoned full, he will open up the throttle and open up the water bypass valves. You need to, in general, try and learn on a car you're using where the water gauge is when the tank is full. Now that's somewhat easier on the condenser cars since they have a dial gauge and it reads full when it's full. On the cars that have the sight water gauge on the side, there is not necessarily a mark indicating where it's full. So most of the time, if you've put the car away and you know that the water tank was full, and you come back the next day and the water tank is half empty, you know, either there's a big pool of water under the car or else it went into the boiler. If you have any questions about whether you think the boiler is full of water or not, you need to try and ask. Now the next thing you check is the lower tricock. That's a valve that's about a third of the way up the boiler. It's pretty much all the cars have it. I think one of the condensers has it as part of the kidney valve. But when you open up that valve, you should see water coming out. And that tells you you have water at least a third of the way up the boiler. Now that valve you will check again as you go through the firing up procedure to ensure that you still have water. So if for some reason your boiler only started out, say, a third or half full, when you go through the procedure to drain water out of it, then in theory the water could drop below that lower tricock. So you'll check that again later. Once you get the car into position, which usually either means rolling it out the front of the museum or possibly going out the back along the road somewhere, is when you'll commence the steam up process. We don't steam up any cars inside the museum. We don't put fire on them until they're out. You want to open up the front blow-off valves and drain out approximately 3 to 4 gallons of water. Now that depends upon the car. Generally for the condensers, that's probably going to be the right number. For say the 10 horsepower cars, it wouldn't be quite that much. But for the most part, you'll be learning, at least initially, on the larger cars with the 23-inch boilers. Once you've drained out the water, then you check that lower tricock again and make sure you still have water coming out of the lower tricock. have a little section in here on torches. Originally, Stanley's would have just been started for the most part with acetylene. And of course, when the cars, most of them, well, in the earlier years, had acetylene lights, they had an extra line running off the acetylene tank that just was used for a torch to heat up the burners. Actually, some of the later condensing cars had an electric resistive heating element. I don't know of anybody today that uses those things. You know of anyone, Tom, that, I guess they weren't that reliable, or they didn't.
Too hard on the battery too.
They didn't have longevity to them. Oh, it's going to bring down propane. Generally, most people either use MAP gas or just propane. You know, they're obviously both readily available. The MAP gas burns a little hotter. In general, some torch heads are acceptable for MAP, some aren't. But it burns a little hotter. They'll both heat up fine. I mean, it may be a few seconds quicker with this, but they'll both heat fine, and that's not a problem. So at this point, you've checked all your fluids, you've charged your pilot tank, you've let water out of the boiler. Now you're ready to start heating up the burner forks and the pilot. So I have down here approximately 3 minutes. You know, a little more is not going to hurt it, and you'll get to learn it as you do it. But somewhere in that zone, we'll get it hot enough to light the pilot, and then basically you open up the pilot. I say on here 1 full turn. That's probably more than necessary, but somewhere. Once you get beyond probably 1/4 of a turn, that's as open as the pilot needs to be. Now once you open the pilot valve, you'll light the pilot through the peephole and continue to heat the burner forks. As you heat the burner forks, you're essentially sucking all the oxygen with the torch, and the pilot will frequently go out. So you just kind of stick the torch back in there and relight the pilot as you're continuing to heat the burner forks. You could go on and continue to heat the burner forks for another couple of minutes. And then you're pretty much ready to go. One of the things that you'll normally see, little whiffs of smoke start coming out of the nozzles on the burner forks. This smoke is some of the fuel that's in there that's just kind of heating up enough to smoke, and that's sort of an indication usually that you got enough heat, and that now you're getting in the zone of ready to light the main burner. At this point, you want to make sure your pilot's burning, and close the peephole, and shut off your torch. And then you're going to get ready to open up the firing up valve. Now, if anybody has any questions while I'm going through this, just please stop me and ask. Because I know you've been through burners, but I haven't sat through all the classes. But you open up the firing up valve, which of course is feeding the pilot fuel now directly into the main burner forks. And the pilot fuel in this case being hexane, which vaporizes much quicker. So you don't need nearly the heat in the vaporizer in order to vaporize the hexane into the main burner forks, which will get the main burner going. You kind of want to open up that firing up valve 1/4 to 1/2 turn and then close it quickly. You may do this a couple of times before the burner actually lights, because it has to push fuel a good ways through the tubes leading up to the vaporizer and then into the vaporizer. And you don't want to shove too much fuel into the burner initially. So you kind of give it this open it, shut it, and it may take 2 or 3 times before the burner actually lights. When the burner lights, you'll hear it as kind of a woof. And you should see some smoke then coming up through the burner. Gee, I think I missed one thing on here. As you start this process, you'll have the hood open and you'll have the little flipper on the top of the boiler opened up. So you'll be able to look down and see the tubes. But you'll keep the flap open while you're firing it up. I need to add. Once you start feeding it fuel, I have a couple of warnings. Don't get too close and look into the mixing tubes as fuel's starting to go in there. I know it seems like kind of an inquisitive thing to look in there and try and figure out where the fuel's going or something, but that you'll learn the hard way. Because once in a while they will flash back. And they will flash back with a bang sometime. The same warning kind of goes for the peak hole. When you have the main burner on, don't look in the peak hole. Because the fuel coming up through there may decide that it likes the air on the outside of the peak hole better than on the inside. So it can burn out through there. I have down here, operate the burner from the firing up valve for approximately 2 minutes. Now generally you won't leave it on, but after the first minute you could leave it cracked a little bit. Part of the key to this is watching the fuel dry out. And by dry out, as the fuel first goes through the burner forks, it will appear wet, that is kind of misty or hazy as the fuel is going into the mixing tubes. Once that fuel dries out, you basically won't see it. It basically, once it completely dries out, it's now gas coming out of there. So you just won't see the fuel at all going in. You'll hear it. You'll hear the airflow, but you won't see the fuel. That is basically the pilot fuel drying out, going into the mixing tubes. Now once that fuel has gotten good dried out, that's kind of when you're in the zone of ready to turn the main burner on. So at this point you want to make sure the firing up valve is turned off and move over to the main fuel valve. Now if the car has a pressure retaining valve, at this point you want to open it. The 735 and the 740 don't have pressure retaining valves, and I'm not sure which car, but the 725 does, and all of the older cars do. The pressure retaining valve is basically a valve between the pumps and the two high pressure cylinders that are holding the main fuel in the air. And what it was originally there for was to keep the air pressure from bleeding off through the check valves in the pumps. Because this essentially just caps the air into those tanks and doesn't let it into the checks. You'll kind of go through the same procedure. You'll give the main burner valve a quarter turn or so and then close it quickly. At this point you have fuel that is all through your lines and all through your vaporizer. So the main burner should pretty much immediately relight. Now you got to remember that as soon as that burner relights, that's still burning the pilot fuel, because the kerosene, which you're now inserting into the system, has to work its way through to the nozzles. So you give it a couple of these quarter turns or so, and then you'll start seeing the kerosene come through, and that will appear once again as kind of wet fuel. And you'll see it come through as wet, and then it will start heating up, and it will basically go clear or into a vapor. At this point you're going to have to start hand pumping the main fuel pressure. So somebody will either need to sit up in the front, or the person that's firing it up can sit up in the front seat and pump. And you'll have to pump for the next 10 to 15 minutes periodically as you go through the firing up procedure. Now, one of the key things that's a little bit hard to figure out as you're starting to learn the car is the air pressure that's in the main fuel tanks, the little pressurized main fuel tanks. There's a cushion of air in there as well as fuel. The idea of the cushion of air is to make sure that the pressure is even, as well as providing that pressurized cushion so you don't need to pump all the time. Now, I kind of brought the valve in, but if when the valve is up here, and if you're sitting in the car with the main burner on, say about a quarter of a turn, and you kind of glance down at the valve, and you can see the needle move as you glance down and glance back up, then in general you don't have enough air in your main. If the needle is moving that fast. It's kind of hard for me to describe the rate, but if you glance down and you see it moving, and you glance back up, that's kind of moving too fast. I mean, you should kind of have to, you know, watch it for a few seconds before you see the needle move. And it's kind of the same thing as you pump. If you pump a stroke and you see the fuel pressure go up 3 to 5 psi in one stroke, then you don't have enough air in the main fuel tanks. I mean, every stroke should probably result in, I don't know, about a half psi or so of increase in pressure if you have enough pressure in those. Now, once the kerosene dries out, then you'll basically just go and leave the main burner on, which will be somewhere in the quarter turn zone. It can vary with cars, but generally you don't want them howling, or very little bit. The discussions of how much Stanley should howl, I think Tom could probably go into for an hour or two, but various people have different feelings as to how much they should. But generally, a little bit or none is preferable. Especially around here when you get 3 or 4 people trying to fire cars up at the same time. It's hard to, it can be hard to tell which car you're listening to. Whether you're listening to your car or another car. This gets quite interesting in the tours when you get 20 or 30 people all trying to fire the car up at the same time. Now at this point, the drip chest valve should be open. That should be open when the car is in the museum, and that should stay open throughout the whole process. That is the valve that's normally outside the driver on most cars. It's outside the car normally between kind of the front seat and the back seat. On the 740, it is inside on the floor right next to the driver. But the drip chest is basically letting steam, water, etc. come out of the bottom of the chest that's between the 2 cylinder banks. This keeps water from building up that could be shoved into the cylinders. As the car starts to make steam, of course, you have the throttle open. You know, it will run through the system and go out through the steam chest in the engine. And you'll start seeing, the very first thing you'll start seeing are spits of steam and water and whatever kind of come out through that drip chest. As the car starts to make more steam, of course, you have to close the throttle to just a small amount because you want steam coming out of the drip chest at all times during the firing up procedure. But of course, you don't want all your steam coming out of the drip chest or you'll never fire up. And that's kind of hard to describe too, and that'll be just something that you'll learn as you get going. How much is too much steam and how much is not enough steam. This is also acting to help heat the engine up, so that as you're firing up the car, the engine's heating up, which is a good thing. So when you get to actually moving the car, I have down here a note that there's a nut that's located right above the burner forks that hold the burner forks on. Sometimes you'll see whiffs of a little bit of what appear to be smoke coming out of that. I say down here that it must be tightened. Not necessarily must be tightened. Sometimes as you heat up the car a little bit, then the metal will expand and close that off. But that's kind of something that you'll get a feel for too. And quite often it may not be there at all, but if it's there and it is smoking when you pretty much get it fired up, you need to tighten that nut up. That's not something you want to just go off and drive and have that. And basically that's the seal between the burner forks and the vaporizer tube. Making sure that, and that's what that nut is holding the burner forks on. It's making sure that that is well sealed. Once the car starts to make steam, you have to make sure that there is steam coming out of the drip chest. And drip chests can get clogged up. So once you're making steam, or once you think you're making steam, if you don't see steam coming out of the drip chest, then that's definitely a problem. Especially if you have the throttle open, which is of course what you're supposed to have, but the cars will move. But that's not the biggest problem. The biggest problem is that if you have that drip chest clogged, then of course you're just getting a lot of water and stuff built up in the engine, which then could easily damage the engine as you start to move the car. So if you're going through the firing up process and you don't see steam coming out through the drip chest, then it's time to stop and figure out what's going on. Or check with somebody to make sure that you're actually making steam. Once the steam pressure has reached 400 psi, that's basically the time to turn off the main fuel valve and close the throttle. Now this somewhat depends upon how many cars are going and what's going on around here. Once you get up above 300, you can start moving the car around and you could actually depart if you're ready to depart. Quite often, as we're getting a number of cars steamed up, some obviously get steamed up before others. So we kind of get them steamed up and then wait and leave as a group. You don't want to let the car, let it steam to the point where the steam automatic shuts off the fuel, which will be up somewhere between 450 and 500. Because the problem with that is then you can't relight the burner because the steam pressure is too high. Once the steam automatic shuts off the fuel, and you're going to let the car sit for a while, then of course the burner cools off and you can't relight it because the steam pressure is high enough that it has shut the fuel off to the main. The idea with keeping the pressure a little bit lower, as you move the car around the property and get ready to go, you can give it a shot of fuel once in a while, relight the burner, and keep the burner and everything hot. Because what you really want to do is that when you are ready to roll out onto the street, you want to relight the burner on the property, ensure that the burner is lit properly, and that you're making steam, and then roll out onto the street. You don't want to roll out onto the street with a cold burner and then have to wait till your steam pressure gets down to relight it. Once you get up to, say, between 300 and 400 psi and you're ready to start moving the car around, this is when you want to close off the drip chest except for a little bit. And you want to shift the car back and forth or move it around a little on more or less a level surface in order to heat the engine up more. And as you do this for, say, the first few hundred feet or 500 feet or 800 feet of moving the car, you want to have that drip chest open just a little bit. And that'll make sure that any water or anything that gets into the engine goes out through the drip chest and not into the cylinders. once you've moved the car around a little bit, you can close the drip chest if you are continuing to move the car or you're heading out on the open road. If you're shifting the car around, say to get fuel or to get water, then as soon as you stop, you're going to want to open the drip again. I mean, for the most part, it's good practice just to open the drip whenever you stop. Now, when you're on the open road, if you stop for a minute or two as you're driving the car, you don't really need to open the drip. But basically, it's a good habit to get into, to just open the drip whenever you stop. I mean, you don't do it at traffic lights and intersections and things like that, but I mean, whenever you stop the car somewhere, just open the drip. Coming to one of the first good warnings. Stanleys are pretty fast cars for the time. They were very fast cars, and that's what they were known for. They go just as fast backwards as they go forward. Since there is no transmission, there are no gears, everything is direct driven. As fast as it goes forward, it will go backwards. So, extreme care is to be taken when you start learning how to drive and backing up. This combined with the fact that there's a delay that exists between the application of steam and when the car will actually start to move, as well as a delay that exists when you turn steam off. So, you know, as you're getting used to backing it, just giving it a little steam and backing off on the steam is kind of a good thing, because that second or two delay, you kind of have to get used to. Because if you start to give it steam and it doesn't move, then the first instinct is to give it more steam. That's not what you want to do, because in that second or two that it takes you to think about that is when it's finally getting back to the engine. Now, as you're starting to get used to backing the car, one of the things you can do is open the drip a little bit. And that will effectively reduce the steam going to the engine. So that's just kind of like making it harder for you to go backwards too fast. But it is a good idea to practice backing up a little bit where you have a lot of space behind you. And you know, you have a chance. Now, obviously, as you drive the car, you'll get a chance. You'll get a feel for the throttle and going forward. At some point, as you're shifting the car around the property, before you leave the property, you'll typically give one of the boiler valves a blow-off in order to ensure that the 3-tube indicator is working. Now, the two of the condensers don't have 3 tubes, they have kidney gauges. But actually, I don't even know, Tom, is that a similar thing you'll do with those? I don't
It's a good idea, because they might have oil in that little chamber, and it's a good idea to give them a blow, keep them clean.
So, with the 3-tube, you can either do this yourself, or if you have somebody sitting in there, you kind of give it a blow for 2 seconds or 3 seconds, and then you may see a second delay, and you'll see the water in the 3-tube kind of go up and down. If you don't see the water in the 3-tube going up and down, then either you haven't given it enough of a blow off, or there could be something clogged in the 3-tube, which is definitely not a good thing. So if you have any indication that your 3-tube is not working right, or your water level indicator is not working right, then you need to stop and figure out why that's acting up. What are we doing for time? Listen to your Stanley. One of the things that I found was probably the most challenging in learning how to drive the car was the new set of sounds. So, you know, most people have gotten used to listening to cars in the way that you're used to. And there's a whole set of sounds that people are very familiar with most antique cars and even new cars. Well, the Stanleys have a whole different set of sounds. And learning those sounds and learning what they mean and when to hear them is challenging. And you really have to kind of try and pay attention to that. You really have to try and, see if you can figure out what those sounds are. The difference between a water pump that's pumping water and a water pump that's not pumping water. Just because you close a bypass valve doesn't mean that the pump's pumping. It just means that you've closed the bypass valve. Now, most of the time it does mean that the pump is pumping, but once in a while the pump won't be pumping. You can learn to hear the difference between the one that's pumping and one that's not pumping. Now, it's a little bit easier to hear that difference on a non-condenser than it is with the condensers, because with the condensers, the pump box is driven off the rear axle as opposed to the non-condensers where the pump box is driven off the motor. And the difference being is that the condensers run at about 1/4 of the speed, the stroke speed. Although the stroke is longer, it's running much slower. So the sounds aren't quite as pronounced. You can certainly hear a strong pilot versus a weak pilot. Now, that's not so much while you're driving, but if you're standing, near the pilot in the car when it's stationary, you should pretty much be able to tell what kind of pilot you have by the sound. Of course, that's the same thing with the burner. You'll learn to hear the burner, and you should be able to listen to tell if it's a healthy burner or if it's not a healthy burner. The motors can make a lot of noises. Most of the serious noises a motor would make are bad. Mostly they're very quiet as you're just running. I mean, you won't hardly hear anything. But if you hear much in the way of a noise coming out of the motor, that's usually not a good sign. That's something as you start to drive the car, and certainly as you're a passenger in the car, or if you're in the passenger while other people are driving, you ought to take some time to try and concentrate to see if you can tell the difference between some of those noises when you're not worried about driving. Out on the wide open road, when you're finally ready to leave the property and everybody has gotten fueled up if they need to get fueled up, everyone has gotten topped off with water, you want to relight the main burner. If you've sat here for a good long time, maybe like an hour or so, or even half an hour, you may want to give it a shot or two of the firing up valve again. Because of course your burner's had a lot of time now to cool off and that sort of thing. Your pilot's still on, so everything is hot. Of course your boiler's very hot because you have 400 or so PSI of steam in there. But to initially relight the burner with some of the pilot fuel will of course ensure that you get a good flame burning in there again, and then you quickly switch over to the kerosene. Now, as soon as you do this, basically you want to be out on the road. As soon as you get that main burner lit at this point, you really just want to be on the road. So you want to do this just before you actually depart onto the road. As soon as you get out on the road, you hook up the reversing pedal. And that'll basically stay hooked up until you come to a stop. A couple of things about being out on the open road. I think you're going to be learning how to drive the condensers, which are left-hand drive cars, but of course a lot of these cars are right-hand drive cars, which most cars built prior to 1915 were right-hand drive, except for Model Ts for some reason,
Yeah,
which were
except
always
Ford.
left-hand drive. People who've never driven right-hand drive cars before tend to drive down the middle of the road. So, you know, you get cars coming at you, going every which direction. So there is a little consideration to be taken as you're learning how to drive a right-hand drive car, which probably won't be the case initially. Following too closely, don't do it. Generally, it's a bad idea with antique cars in general to follow too closely, because you'd like to give people that may come up behind you a chance to pass, so you don't want 2 or 3 cars all stacked up together, because then it makes it much harder for them to go around. Especially non-condensing Stanleys, all the oil is coming out of the back of the car. And if you follow too closely behind a non-condensing Stanley, then your car will then be the recipient of the cylinder oil. Now, I've been on some HCCA tours, Horseless Carriage Club of America, which are 1915 cars and older. And, you know, if you get 10 cars or so out there, and sometimes you have a Stanley, you know, somebody who's not familiar with the Stanleys will end up following one of the Stanleys too close. And you'll hear it later, I'll never do that again. So people will learn their lesson. It usually takes one time. Other sorts of reasons for following too closely. I can remember one, it was a gaslight tour in Biglerville. I don't know if that was the one you were on. But, of course, in the gaslight tour, everyone's kind of bunched up because they're touring through town. We got to one spot where we were crossing a road to the left into this parking lot of the shopping center. And there was just a slight incline. Well, one of the cars in the front stalled, and then 2 or 3 cars behind that was a Pullman that had this electric transmission, and, well, Don couldn't get it in reverse. So you had one car in the front that wouldn't start, and one car in the back that couldn't go in reverse. This while you had cars trying to go both ways down this road. It's a big mess. When you get into hilly climates, or hilly terrain, you want to allow plenty of space. Because the thing you don't want to be doing with any car of these vintage is to get halfway up a steep hill and have to stop behind somebody. You want to be able to have enough space that if you see somebody that stopped on the hill, you can either A, stop the bottom, B, you can go into a driveway or somewhere off the road, or C, you can make plans that you can see that there's clear space just to go around them and go to the top. If you think it's somebody that really needs help, then you need to try and get your car off the road somewhere, either at the top, the bottom, or in the middle, and then run down and run up the hill to help. The Stanleys, although they're very powerful cars, are not necessarily really great at starting up a steep hill in the middle of a steep hill, especially if you stop for several minutes and the engine has a chance to start cooling off. And of course, this is pretty much similar with all cars of the age, but just you really want to have some space in there so you have a chance to react. Use the throttle, you know, gently. Here again, these are 90-year-old cars, and you know you don't want to jerk the throttle. So you just kind of want to, you know, give the throttle little nudges to get it up. You'll get the feel as it goes on. But a 20 horsepower Stanley engine puts out about 700 or 800 foot-pounds of torque. They have a lot of torque to them. As you're rolling down the road, as Charlie Johnson, who's a restorer of Stanleys, told me when I was starting to learn how to drive a Stanley, he said, Stanleys are easy to drive if you don't have to watch the road. This is when you start looking at the gauges. And you know, you want to look at your steam pressure gauge and make sure that it's staying up. Now, at the speeds that we should be driving, or that you should be driving as you learn, the steam pressure should pretty much always be up between 400 and 500. If you ever see the steam pressure start dropping fast, that's a bad sign. That's a pretty good sign that there's something wrong with the main pump. So that's kind of you need to figure out what's going on pretty quick. If you get to going up hills and then the car starts pumping a lot of water, that of course will be hard on the steam pressure. Because all that water going into the boiler obviously is dumping sort of cold water into a boiler, so that's helping to depress the steam pressure, as well as it's extra work on the engine to pump the water in. You need to keep a close eye on the water level in the boiler, either on the kidney gauge or the 3-tube. And as you drive the car, you'll start to understand, how a particular gauge works. There's several things about the water gauges. One, of course, as the car noses down a hill, then water in the boiler, of course, goes to the front of the boiler, which will make the gauge think that it's got less water in the boiler. And likewise, as the car goes up a hill, the water comes to the back of the boiler and makes the gauge think that there's more water in the boiler. You also have to remember that those water gauges are not an indicator of the boiler water level throughout the entire boiler. It is only a window that is in about the middle third to half of the boiler that it is indicating what the level is. So if you get the level below that or above that, that tends to confuse the gauge and confuse the operator a lot more if you get out of that zone. And that's where things can get a little trickier, is trying to figure out how much water you have in the boiler. More water in the boiler is probably better than less. Certainly if you get the water in the boiler overfilled, you'll start getting some water back in towards the engine, which of course is a bad thing if you get too much water back into the engine. But one of the indicators, if you ever get the water in the boiler too full, is that you'll have a lot of steam pressure but no power.